As he ran for his first presidential term in 2016, Donald Trump said, "I think Islam hates us. There is something there, tremendous hatred there, and we have to get to the bottom of it." Upon election, Trump signed an executive order barring the citizens of 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the US. When asked by the interviewer what the reason for the hatred is, or if it's rooted in the Islamic faith, Trump confessed that he didn't know. Whilst Trump's claims of hatred may be hyperbole, there certainly is resentment towards America amongst many Muslim societies. Trump's ignorance on the cause of this anger may not be surprising given his track record, but thankfully the pages of history tells us a very compelling story. One that is filled with CIA-engineered regime change, invasions that led to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, economic exploitation, and consistent hypocrisy about human rights. Today, we seek to answer his question, why do Muslims hate America? Contrary to popular belief, Islam and Muslims are not eternally opposed to America and the West. In fact, there have been many instances where Muslim states and peoples had high opinions of the United States. For example, the first country to recognize the independence of the United States was Morocco. Later, after World War I, a survey taken of the Arabs in the Levant found that they desired an independent, unified state, but if a mandate was necessary, then they preferred the US to Britain and France. This was because America was perceived as an anti-colonial country that could have been an alternative to the European imperialists who caused untold tragedy in Muslim lands. Even in 1956, the United States had forced Britain, France and Israel to withdraw their troops from Egypt and accept Jamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, further contributing to America's positive reputation amongst many Muslims. But beginning in the second half of the 20th century, America's status as a global superpower and its intense capitalism created a constant clash with the Islamic world. The US's insatiable need for oil conflicted with the aspirations of many Muslims to control their own resources and, by extension, their futures. Later, Muslim politicians and thinkers would come up with ideological explanations that would cement opposition to America, just as American public figures, particularly those influenced by Zionism, would purport that Western and Islamic civilizations were diametrically opposed to each other. The many explanations for the clash of civilizations fail to recognize that the intense hatred some Muslims have for America is not centuries old, but a result of recent events. In this video, we will detail how key political events in the Middle East over the last 80 years soured the Muslim opinion of the United States. These events are the American-backed coup d'etat in Iran 1953, American assistance to Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, America's stationing of troops in the Arabian Peninsula and the war against Iraq in 1990 and 1991, and last but not least, the War on Terror and America's invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. The Qajar dynasty, which ruled Persia from 1789 to 1925, presided over a period of decline marked by weak central authority and growing foreign interference. Both Britain and Russia exploited Iran's resources through capitulations. These treaties granted foreign powers and companies disproportionate control in exchange for developing Persia's industry. The Qajars, lacking foresight and leverage, signed lopsided deals. When British prospectors struck oil in 1908, Persia's petroleum industry was born and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was established. In spite of the name, the company wasn't very Persian. Only 16% of profits went to the producing country. When oil's lucrativeness became apparent, resentment grew as the benefits bypassed the Persian people. Even under Reza Shah Pahlavi, who took power in 1925, little changed. his 1933 renegotiation only marginally improved the terms. Meanwhile, Iran's oil became vital to Britain. Abadan's refinery, the largest in the world, supplied 85% of the British Navy's oil, whilst ordinary Iranians lived in poverty and oil workers toiled in squalor for pitiful wages. Nationalization, which promised to reclaim oil wealth for the Iranian people, emerged as a unifying popular cause. The nationalist-dominated Iranian parliament elected in 1950 quickly demanded transparency from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or the AIOC. When the AIOC refused, Parliament revoked its concession in March 1951 and appointed Mohammad Mossadegh, a veteran nationalist, as Prime Minister the next month. Mossadegh enjoyed massive popular support but faced fierce British opposition. Britain responded with a naval blockade and a global boycott of Iranian oil, putting immense pressure on the economy. Nonetheless, Mossadegh remained steadfast. When the Shah and his allies tried to dismiss him, mass protests forced the Shah to flee. For many Iranians, this was more than a fight over oil. Nationalists also resented the Shah's sweeping power in addition to British influence. The Shah's weakness and the public's resolve deepened British urgency, leading them to seek American assistance. Initially, the US was reluctant. At this point, America's foreign policy still retained some anti-imperialist sentiment, and the crisis seemed like Britain's problem. Nevertheless, the British managed to convince the Americans to join their efforts to overthrow Mossadegh. What changed? Conventional history holds that the influence of the leftist Tudeh party during Mossadegh's time led to American involvement, a reasonable motive in the Cold War context. However, newly declassified CIA and MI6 files showed that protecting Western oil interests was central to American involvement. A fully nationalized oil industry in Iran threatened to influence other countries where American companies held shares in the oil industry. Adding on, a non-aligned country controlling the price and output of oil could put any military maneuvers against the Soviet Union in jeopardy. Even before the coup, American oil companies were negotiating for a share of Iran's oil future. Operation Ajax, a joint CIA-MI6 effort, involved enlisting royalist Iranians, bribing Iranian officials, planting propaganda, and staging civil unrest. The CIA paid mobsters to incite riots and helped sway the Shah to return. Western media smeared Mossadegh as unstable, while local press, funded by the CIA, vilified him. A task that was made easier due to some of his authoritarian measures being unpopular with many Iranians anyway. On August 19, 1953, the coup succeeded after street clashes killed 200 to 300 people. Mossadegh's cabinet was dismantled, some members were executed, and Iran's democratically elected leader was imprisoned. The Shah returned to absolute power, relying on repression to maintain control. His regime executed political prisoners and used torture extensively through Savak, the secret police. Backed and bankrolled by the US, Iran became a key Cold War ally. American companies received significant shares in the newly formed oil consortium, a reward for their role in toppling Mossadegh. Ultimately, the Shah's authoritarian rule, economic failures, and lack of legitimacy, compounded by his Western backing, led to his downfall in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The new Islamic Republic's hostility toward the US stems in part from this history. For many Iranians, the 1953 coup and its aftermath explains why Marg bar Amrika, death to America, remains a powerful and enduring slogan. The creation of Israel and the ensuing displacement of Palestinians in 1948 in the Nakba generated lasting anger among Arabs at both governmental and popular levels. The loss of Palestine was a source of humiliation, and the influx of refugees burdened neighboring states. The partition itself, which triggered this, was imposed largely by foreign powers, especially the United States. With a strong Zionist lobby and an election approaching, President Harry Truman backed partition, reportedly saying, "Sorry gentlemen, I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs as constituents." US officials lobbied and pressured other countries, even threatening aid cuts, to secure the 2/3 majority needed for the revolution on partition to pass at the UN. Despite America's role in the displacement, its relations with Israel were initially lukewarm. The US remained neutral during the 1948 war and forced Israel to retreat from the Sinai during the 1956 Suez Crisis. At the time, US policy was more balanced. One CIA attaché in Amman noted his assistance to Jordan, while CIA colleagues in Tel Aviv supported Israel. The period after the 1967 Six-Day War saw deepening ties between the US and Israel. America's Zionist lobby helped promote the myth of Israel as a weak state surrounded by hostile Arabs, encouraging unconditional US support. Strategically, American officials saw Israel as a potential enforcer of US interests in the Middle East, keeping Arab states divided and stifling their attempts to control their resources, especially oil. Another motivating factor for American support was Israel helping counter Soviet-backed Arab regimes. This Cold War logic prevailed in 1973 when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise war to reclaim the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Viewing both as Soviet allies, US President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger firmly backed Israel, ignoring UN resolutions calling its occupations illegal, as well as the context in which the conflict occurred. Though the Arab forces had initial success, Israel regained momentum. They fought Egypt to a stalemate and pushed the Syrians further back into their territory. A key factor was US military aid. Israel requested $800 million in arms, $5.6 billion today, but President Nixon approved a $2.2 billion airlift, roughly $16 billion today. America's role in reversing Arab gains entrenched a pattern of uncritical support for Israel, in spite of the continuing occupation of Palestinian land. This, alongside constant human rights violations, particularly the ongoing genocide in Gaza, has fueled Muslim hostility toward the US for decades. One major consequence of the 1973 war was the oil embargo led by Saudi King Faisal. A staunch pan-Islamist and supporter of Palestine, Faisal had long considered using oil as leverage. The occupation of Jerusalem in 1967 deeply affected him. A relative reported that he rarely smiled from the day it occurred. Outraged by US support for Israel, he led Arab OPEC members in cutting oil production and embargoing pro-Israel countries, especially the US. Oil prices quadrupled, bringing great wealth to OPEC states. The embargo was lifted after partial Israeli withdrawals and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's assurance that the American stance was becoming more balanced. Faisal's reputation soared in the Muslim world. Beyond his foreign policy, he modernized Saudi Arabia, industrializing, abolishing slavery, and expanding education, including for women. Yet these reforms angered Wahhabis, a prominent group in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that believes in literal and hardline interpretations of Islam. In 1965, they violently protested the establishment of TV stations in the kingdom, for they viewed depicting human faces as haram. Among them was Prince Khalid, a nephew of Faisal, killed by a policeman during an attack on a station. His brother, Prince Faisal ibn Musaid, later assassinated the king in 1975. Though mental illness and resentment over his brother's death offer reasonable explanations for the murder, the prince's previous residence in the US and the king's bold stance led to suspicions of foul play throughout the Muslim world. The king's death was widely blamed on the CIA, reinforcing anti-American sentiment. His successors, under growing Wahhabi influence and flush with oil wealth, began exporting this puritanical interpretation abroad. However, it was not in Saudi Arabia, but in Afghanistan, where militant Wahhabism would reach its zenith. In a Cold War context, one would think the Soviet Union would take advantage of America's missteps to bring Muslim-majority countries into their sphere, but this was not a walk in the park. The Soviet Union's anti-imperialist stance won it some allies in the Muslim world, but many viewed communism as fundamentally incompatible with Islam. Soviet officials interpreted Marx's quote about religion being the opium of the masses as a justification to suppress religion, viewing it as a tool of oppression. As a result, Islam and religious Muslims were harshly persecuted, which made countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan wary of Soviet influence. On the other hand, some people living in the Muslim world, including Afghan communists, saw religious institutions as outdated and sought change. In 1978, Afghan communists violently seized power and launched sweeping reforms that many saw as attacks on Afghan culture and Islam. They struggled to maintain control against religious insurgents known as the Mujahideen and called for Soviet intervention, which came at the end of 1979. The Soviets invaded, assassinated the president, and installed a loyal replacement. Motivations remained debated, since the Soviets had refused to militarily intervene in Afghanistan the previous year. The answer may have to do with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Had Khomeini's ideology spread to neighboring Afghanistan, Islamism could potentially inspire Afghanistan's neighbors in Muslim-majority Soviet Central Asia. However, the invasion backfired. An atheist army on Muslim soil defending an unpopular regime was met with fierce resistance. The Soviet military responded with torture, bombings, and massacres, fueling Islamist fervor. Afghans of all backgrounds fought back using guerrilla tactics in difficult terrain, earning the war the nickname the Soviets' Vietnam. For the US, the Mujahideen became a proxy to weaken the USSR. President Reagan praised them as freedom fighters, and billions of dollars in CIA aid flowed to them, coordinated by Saudi and Pakistani intelligence. The Muslim world largely supported the fight, both financially and with volunteers. The two most important Afghan Arabs were the Palestinian Abdullah Azzam and the Saudi Osama bin Laden. Azzam, born near Jenin, Palestine in 1941, was expelled to Jordan after the Six-Day War. He was an excellent and eloquent student who pursued religious education in Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, later teaching in Saudi Arabia. Viewing both his homeland and Afghanistan as occupied Muslim lands, he argued that jihad was a religious obligation for every physically able man. His call was backed by Saudi Arabia's top cleric, Ibn Baz. Bin Laden, an heir to Saudi Arabia's largest construction empire, joined Azzam's efforts, funding and organizing fighters while liaising with Saudi intelligence. What began as Maktab al-Khadimat, Office for Services, evolved into Al-Qaeda by 1988. In the end, the Mujahideen successfully expelled the Soviets from Afghanistan. While Azzam was assassinated right after their triumph, bin Laden returned home to a hero's welcome. Soon, a crisis pitted Al-Qaeda and their Saudi benefactors against each other, with the matter of contention being American intervention. Along with scaring the Soviet Union, Iran's Islamic Revolution scared almost everyone else. The most immediately threatened governments were those of Iraq and the Persian Gulf. Ayatollah Khomeini, the charismatic cleric at the head of the revolution, wanted to export it to secular dictatorships like Iraq, another Shia majority country, and the absolute monarchies of the Gulf, whom he felt were un-Islamic. Iran's instability, unresolved border disputes, and regional isolation led Iraq to invade Iran in September 1980. Saddam Hussein, backed by the US, the Soviet Union, and Gulf monarchies, framed the war as an effort to protect the Arab world from Khomeini's revolution. The war dragged on for 8 years, ending in a stalemate that left Iraq with mountains of debt. Saddam expected debt forgiveness from the Gulf states, who provided most of the war's funding, but was rebuffed. He directed his frustrations towards Kuwait, Iraq's small, vulnerable neighbor. Kuwait was accused of exceeding OPEC production quotas, lowering oil prices, thereby hindering Iraq's ability to repay debt, and slant drilling into Iraqi oil fields. Iraq further claimed that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, carved out by British imperialists to block Iraqi access to the sea. In August 1990, Iraq invaded and occupied Kuwait. Gulf states panicked. The Iraqi military was the fourth largest in the world and vastly experienced, while their own militaries were weak. Fearing Saddam might conquer the Gulf and control the bulk of global oil reserves, Saudi Arabia sought US protection. Jordan's King Hussein, a friend of Saddam, obtained a promise from him to withdraw within days if no public condemnation was issued and the matter was handled within the Arab world. But US Secretary of State James Baker convinced Egypt and Saudi Arabia to condemn Iraq, paving the way for conflict. The UN gave Iraq a withdrawal deadline of January 15, 1991. When Saddam refused, a US-led coalition launched an overwhelming air and ground campaign that routed Iraqi forces. Internationally, the intervention had broad support. Iraq's invasion was a clear breach of international law, and Saddam's human rights abuses were highlighted as justification. But this raises deeper questions. The US often backs regimes that violate human rights and consistently supports Israel despite its breaches of international law. So what truly motivated the Gulf War? American strategic goals were central. Iraqi control over Gulf oil reserves and hostility towards Israel made Saddam a threat. Furthermore, to assert America's position as a leader of a new world order in the wake of the Soviet collapse, neutralizing this rogue state was necessary. Many Muslims viewed the intervention positively, and several Muslim-majority nations, including Egypt, Syria, Pakistan, and Senegal, joined the coalition. However, the US military's presence in Saudi Arabia, the land of Islam's most treasured holy sites, angered millions of Muslims worldwide, most notably Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden implored the Saudi defense minister to reject non-Muslim troops, offering Al-Qaeda's fighters instead, claiming they would prevail against the mighty Iraq with faith. Rejected and exiled, bin Laden turned hostile. Al-Qaeda's strategy shifted to terrorism, with the 1998 US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania being a major early example. 3 years later, another devastating attack would permanently alter American-Muslim relations. On September 11, 2001, fighters from Al-Qaeda hijacked planes and flew them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing almost 3,000 people. The attack sent shockwaves around the world. After the Cold War, the US stood as the sole superpower, enjoying economic prosperity. A golden decade known as the Roaring 90s ended with 9/11. A terror attack of this scale on American soil was unprecedented, so fear and anger spread rapidly. Al-Qaeda's leadership claimed the attack aimed to halt US foreign policies that harmed Muslims, support for Israel, sanctions on Iraq, and backing for Middle Eastern autocracies. In a recording, bin Laden cited America's support for Israel's invasion of Lebanon as a turning point. We should destroy towers in America so that they taste some of what we tasted. Instead, 9/11 worsened American perceptions of Muslims and Arabs. For many, this was their first introduction to Islam. In the wake of the attacks, President George W. Bush rallied the public and threatened the Taliban, a radical Islamist organization that ruled Afghanistan, to hand over bin Laden or face consequences. When they refused, the US invaded Afghanistan and overthrew them. Approval of Bush soared, but economic troubles in 2002 caused a decline in his popularity. Soon, Bush and his officials turned to Iraq. accusing Saddam Hussein of developing weapons of mass destruction and supporting Al-Qaeda. These claims were false, of course. Saddam, a secular dictator, was ideologically opposed to bin Laden, and no weapons of mass destruction were found after the Gulf War. Yet the Office for Special Plans, founded by Zionist Bush administration officials with strong ties to Israel, sensationalized and even fabricated intelligence to justify the invasion. One figure, Douglas Faith, had even co-authored a report to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in 1996 that encouraged him to help depose Saddam. 6 years later, Netanyahu appeared in front of Congress and parroted the myth of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, urging the US to intervene against him. Using this false premise, the US illegally invaded Iraq, but the occupation that followed was even worse. The occupying administration disbanded the Iraqi military and fired thousands of Ba'ath Party-affiliated public employees, leaving many trained, armed, and angry men jobless. US soldiers conducted humiliating house raids and detentions. The worst abuse emerged at Abu Ghraib prison, where photos exposed the torture, rape, and murder of detainees. Ironically, this prison was a site of torture during Saddam's rule as well, indicating that the Americans were no liberators themselves. This outraged Iraqis, swelling the ranks of the insurgency and sparking revenge attacks against US troops. More atrocities, such as massacres and the use of depleted uranium in Fallujah, bred hostility. Western firms seized Iraq's oil infrastructure amidst the chaos, while sectarian violence erupted between Sunni and Shia extremists, worsened by America's support for a corrupt, sectarian post-war government. In the shadow of lawlessness, ISIS emerged, fueled by occupation grievances, stolen oil, and leftover US weapons. The group terrorized Iraq and the region for years before being defeated by Iraqi forces with international support. Today, Iraq struggles to rebuild amid persistent political dysfunction, foreign meddling, and infrastructural decay. America's sinful war had killed anywhere from 150,000 to 1 million people, with most estimates holding that this 7-year war had seen more death than a quarter century of Saddam's dictatorship. Once one of the Muslim world's most advanced states, Iraq was reduced to rubble, a legacy that looms large in the collective memory of Muslims worldwide. It is undeniable that swathes of Muslims around the world despise America, and while many distinguish between White House officials and the average Joe, others view them as one and the same. Millions of Muslims have experienced trauma and loss as a direct result of American foreign policy, and millions more feel anger at the plight of their brothers and sisters. The fact that Washington mixes oil with blood contributes to Muslim perceptions of American greed. On top of that, American complicity in Israel's crimes against the Palestinians, coupled with the latter's outside role in American decision-making, only adds fuel to the fire. A more in-touch and friendly American policy towards the Arab and Islamic worlds can bridge the gap between these two societies and benefit millions in the old and new worlds. Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace!